Everyone in the Blackridge estate lived by an unspoken rule: never go near Brutus. Dominic Rourke's Rottweiler Mastiff mix, weighing nearly 60 kilograms, was not a pet. It was a nightmare standing on four legs. Brutus had once torn open a trainer's arm simply because the man stepped a foot wrong in the backyard, snapped a military-grade rope as if it were made of thread, and crushed a stainless steel bowl so completely that the kitchen staff refused to enter that section again. No one dared approach the animal unless they wished to end the day in an emergency room. Even Dominic himself, the owner of the estate, a man who had commanded bloody operations overseas, a cold-controlled force who made arms dealers avert their eyes, kept his distance. That was why, on a quiet afternoon when a short circuit in the old security system caused the magnetic lock to fail, the door to the eastern courtyard drifted open, and an unfamiliar woman stepped into the forbidden zone. The entire estate seemed to stop breathing. Security cameras captured her slowing to a halt on the stone walkway, standing only a few yards from Brutus. The air thickened with a silence so suffocating it felt like pressure on the ribs. Brutus lifted his head from the shadowed patch where he lay, amber eyes glinting with a cold, predatory light. A low growl rose from deep within his chest, so deep it made the window panes tremble. The security team's hands went to their weapons. The butler shouted through the radio, ordering an immediate evacuation. But the woman did not back away. She did not scream. She did not turn to flee. She simply stood there, her brown hair pulled back neatly, her gaze steady on the creature every soul in that mansion feared. And then, in a moment that seemed to short-circuit the entire security system, she bowed her head slightly and whispered something no microphone could catch. Brutus stopped growling. One ear flicked. His stare remained sharp, but shifted into something that resembled confusion. Then the impossible unfolded. The beast everyone believed untamable rose and began walking toward her step by step, as though rediscovering a world it had long shut out. No one moved. Dominic stood on the second-floor balcony, hands gripping the granite railing so tightly his knuckles blanched. The man who had ordered covert missions, who had watched brothers in arms fall before his eyes, had never felt his heart race like this. The dog he himself could not control was approaching a stranger, not to attack but to lower its scarred, heavy head gently into her waiting hand. What the woman did next left the entire estate stunned and peeled back a secret Dominic Rourke had buried so deeply that even he refused to look at it. If you are listening to this and feel something shift inside you, even just a little, take a second to subscribe to our channel, like and share this video so we can keep bringing you stories that stay with you long after the screen goes dark. And if you don't mind, would you tell me where you're watching from? Leave a comment below and let us know where in the world this story has reached you. We treasure every word you share. Brutus was unlike any dog anyone had known. He did not bark like other dogs. He growled with the rumble of a tank engine churning beneath the earth. His dark, coarse coat felt more like armor draped over a body so powerful that even the largest security guards kept their distance. His amber eyes did not merely glare. They assessed, calculated, dissected every tiny motion of anyone nearby, as if waiting for a single mistake before striking. Brutus did not live like a dog. He existed like a weapon forged solely to destroy. Since the tragic accident 3 years ago, no one could claim they had ever truly gotten close to him. The first trainer lasted exactly 22 minutes. He entered the yard with a double-thick leather leash, a padded vest, bite-proof gloves, and the confidence of a man who had tamed hundreds of vicious dogs. Within 10 minutes, he was on the ground, his arms scraped the leash, severed cleanly, and if the iron gate had not slammed shut in time, he might not have walked out in one piece. The second was a veterinarian arriving for a routine check. She came armed with tranquilizers, protective gear, and 3 assistants, but Brutus allowed no one within 3 meters. One lunge, one swipe, one thunderous roar sent the injection kit flying against the wall. She resigned that very night, leaving a report with only 2 words. Not possible. The third did not even have time to explain what happened. He was a newly hired animal care specialist from another state, known for working with the most difficult breeds. In under a minute, Brutus had shredded his equipment bag, raked deep scratches into his plastic shield, and driven him onto the top of a metal bin. When the security team broke open the door, they found him trembling, too terrified to breathe. After that, Dominic ordered the entire eastern courtyard locked down. Additional high-speed cameras were installed, and the entrance was fitted with a two-layer magnetic lock, accessible to only 3 people in the estate. Dominic never stepped into that area without an armed guard at his side, even though he was the one who had brought Brutus back from one of the harshest corners of the world. Staff whispered that Brutus hadn't always been this way. They remembered a time years ago when the great beast would walk quietly through the gardens, a silent shadow guarding something precious. But that was before the rain-slicked road took everything away. Now they called him the monster, the Widowmaker. They avoided the courtyard, not just out of fear of his teeth, but because the sound of his howling at night was too full of sorrow for anyone to bear. Everyone understood that Brutus wasn't just guarding a territory, he was guarding a ghost. No one knew exactly where Brutus came from, only rumors that Dominic brought him back 5 years ago, from a covert war dog facility beyond the Syrian border, where creatures were not taught how to live, but forced to learn how to kill. Some said he survived a battle between 2 entire packs and crawled alone from the metal cages. Others whispered that the jagged scar across his left eye was not from a fight, but from a rusted iron collar he was forced to wear for years, cutting into flesh, until it left a mark where fur never grew back. Dominic never confirmed any of it. He simply told new staff one thing: do not go near Brutus unless you wish to test the final limits of your courage. From then on, the name Brutus became the estate's quiet emblem of fear, not loud, not dramatic, but steady and oppressive like midnight, darkening every corner of Blackridge. What terrified people most was not his strength, but his gaze, an expression that did not belong to an animal, nor to rage, but to an ancient wounded soul that had seen too much loss and was ready to explode if anyone brushed against that buried hurt. Brutus did not bark, he only growled. And every time that sound rolled through the hushed estate, it chilled the human heart straight to the bone. Emma Carter arrived at Blackridge on an early autumn morning when mist still clung to the ancient rows of evergreens lining the long driveway that curved like a ribbon sinking into fog. She came in the capacity of an animal therapist, carrying a file sent from a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting veterans and people who had lived through psychological trauma. In that file was the name of a man called Rourke, a former member of special units now living in seclusion and believed to be keeping an animal with abnormal behavior. What the file did not mention was the true level of danger the animal posed, nor did it say anything about the electronic perimeter fences or the security team wearing headsets around the clock. Emma had never been to an estate like Blackridge. From the moment the iron gates slowly opened through the veil of mist, she felt something different there, something cold like a self-contained world where even time hesitated before crossing the threshold. The butler received her with a grave expression, asking her 3 separate times if she was sure she had come to the right place and understood the nature of the work ahead of her. Emma only nodded her eyes, carrying the calm of someone who had been through so much hurt that she no longer feared things she had not yet seen. She had worked with dogs suffering from post-traumatic stress, had once held a trembling shepherd in her arms for an entire hour in a darkened room without speaking a single word. She believed there was no animal beyond reach if met with enough patience and the right understanding at the right moment. She had no idea that on this particular day, the schedule had been mixed up. Dominic had not booked a therapy session. He did not know anyone was coming. And no one had managed to warn her that the eastern courtyard, the very area Emma accidentally walked into while following an internal path on the estate map, was an absolutely restricted zone. As she walked along the perimeter wall, a sharp metallic sound pierced the silence, the buzzing of a magnetic lock short-circuiting. She stopped. To her right, a heavy iron gate stood slightly ajar, the security light above it flickering erratically between red and green. Then she heard it. Not a growl, but a low, repetitive thud, like a heavy body hitting stone, followed by a faint, high-pitched whimper of distress. It was the sound of an animal in pain. Emma hesitated. She knew she should wait for the butler, but her instinct as a healer overrode her caution. Someone or something was hurting inside those walls. Pushing the heavy gate open just enough to slip through, she stepped into the forbidden zone, not out of carelessness, but out of compassion. She looked up and realized she was standing before a wide-shadowed courtyard, three sides walled in by moss-covered stone, the fourth closed off by a dense line of trees. There were no people, no sounds, only a black dog lying beneath a shaft of sunlight that had slipped through the canopy. For a brief moment, Emma did not recognize that this was Brutus. The light made his fur glisten like velvet. He lay utterly still, as if asleep. Then his eyes opened. That gaze cut through the fragile calm around Emma like a blade. She froze. Not out of fear, but because the stillness was so absolute, it felt as though even the air itself was watching her through those amber eyes. Brutus did not move, yet every muscle beneath the thick hide seemed to coil, bunching, as if preparing to spring. Elsewhere in the mansion, a soft alarm trembled to life. A security officer glanced at the screen and went pale. The butler dropped his teacup. Dominic turned toward the surveillance feed in his office, his face draining of color. All of this because one woman had mistakenly walked into the realm of the beast. But Emma remained where she was. She did not know the name Brutus. She did not know he had cornered men against walls, snapped chains, and driven a veterinarian to flee in terror. She only saw a solitary creature lying alone in the sunlight at the heart of a house as cold as ice. And in that moment, for reasons she could not quite define, she had the uncanny sense that she was looking at a version of herself from many years ago. She took a single step forward, and the world around her began to change. The instant Emma moved that one step, Brutus sprang up. There was no growl, no bark, only the heavy impact of four massive paws striking the stone, echoing like a drumbeat. His amber eyes locked onto the figure of the woman in front of him, unblinking, unbroken. The air turned dense and unmoving. Every sinew in the dog's body tightened, trembling like an arrow drawn to the furthest point, waiting for the string to be released. In the security room, a cascade of danger alerts flashed across the screens. The guards all turned toward the eastern courtyard. One of them opened the internal channel and shouted that an unidentified person was in the restricted zone. On the second floor, Dominic had been leaning against a stone balustrade, espresso cup still warm in his hand, his gaze drifting toward the misty hills when the alarm blared in his earpiece. He turned, strode quickly to the edge of the balcony where he could see into the courtyard below, and he went still. The woman was standing within striking distance of Brutus. She did not move. She simply stood there, her head tilted slightly, eyes fixed on the animal everyone else avoided at all costs. Brutus no longer looked like a dog. He was a wild creature, jolted awake from a nightmare body, rigid muzzle lifting just enough to bare the white of his teeth beneath rough black lips. A single wrong movement, a single sudden sound, and blood would stain the stone of the eastern courtyard. Dominic could not breathe. He had seen Brutus take a man down in 3 seconds. He had watched with his own eyes a draft horse weighing nearly 200 kilograms collapse when it stumbled into the yard and tried to jump the fence. And now a woman stood less than 3 meters from him, empty-handed, no armor, no shield of any kind. He shouted into his radio, his voice raw, ordering every employee to stand down, to do nothing that might provoke Brutus. Even the faintest noise could snap this moment tight as a drawn wire. But Emma still did not move. She had no idea numbers were flashing red through the security system. She did not know how many eyes were fixed on her through the cameras, how many people were holding their breath, bracing for the worst. She only knew that in front of her stood a creature whose body had been torn apart by something larger than anger. She saw the scars crossing his neck, a patch of fur missing on his right shoulder. the web of marks along his muzzle, and in his eyes, not the cold of a predator, but the depth of a soul wounded to its core. Brutus leaned forward, his front legs bent broad shoulders, lowering his nose nearly touching the ground, his tail held rigid, his whole frame taut. It was not an attack stance. It was the hesitant posture of an animal that did not know whether to fight or flee, trapped somewhere in between. A breeze swept through, stirring the branches above them, the rustle of leaves soft as a whisper. Emma slowly inclined her head, not too low, not too quickly, the way one might greet a friend. She did not speak, letting her gaze soften, holding no challenge, no pity, only a quiet, patient presence. And then, under the watch of dozens of eyes glued to the screens as hearts pounded in the chest of the man standing at the balcony, Brutus tilted his head just slightly. His ears flicked. He held that pose for a few endless seconds, then gradually drew his legs back beneath him, neither growling nor snarling, and lowered his massive muscular body to the stone, as slowly as a wave, sinking back into the sea. That large, scarred head came to rest close to the ground, his eyes never leaving Emma. Dominic could not believe what he was seeing. Across the grounds, security staff stared at one another, speechless. Brutus the monster no one dared to approach had lain down before a stranger. And the woman still standing in front of him remained as quiet as if she had always known this moment would come. Deep inside Dominic's chest, something cracked so softly it was almost nothing. The first hairline fracture in the sheet of ice that had encased his heart for so many years. Brutus lay still, his amber eyes locked on the unfamiliar woman standing before him, not close enough to provoke, yet not far enough to escape a strike should everything shift in an instant. The air in the eastern courtyard remained heavy, as though the world itself was holding its breath alongside those watching from behind layers of bulletproof glass and security monitors. But there was no leap, no growl, no sign of an impending attack. Only silence, dense and unbroken, settling over each stone beneath their feet. Emma did not move. She did not reach out, did not call for Brutus, did not retreat. She simply stood there, her head tilted slightly, as if speaking through her gaze alone. There was no fear in her posture, only a strange, steady calm, as though she had grown familiar with standing face to face with pain wrapped in a fearsome shape. 1 minute passed, then 2, then 3. Dominic remained on the balcony, gripping the railing so tightly his knuckles blanched. He had never seen Brutus stay motionless this long before a stranger. The absence of reaction was the most frightening part. And then Emma began to speak. Her voice was neither loud nor sharp, only soft enough to drift across the gray stone, gentle and steady, like rain tapping against an old porch roof. "Hi there," she said, eyes never leaving Brutus. "I don't know your name, but I think you might be tired." Brutus did not move, but one ear flicked. "I once knew a dog with eyes like yours," she continued. "He lived in a shelter. No one dared go near him. People called him bad, called him dangerous. But really, he was just sad. He missed his old owner, missed the home he lost." Her tone remained even, not rising or falling, as if telling a bedtime story to a child. "I don't know what happened to you, but if you want, I'll sit here for a while." Emma slowly lowered herself, her knees touching the stone, her hands resting lightly on her thighs, her back straight, her gaze level with Brutus. Nothing in her movements was sudden. Every gesture was calculated with the care of someone who had faced invisible wounds and knew that even one wrong breath could shatter the fragile space between them. Dominic clenched his jaw. He did not understand who this woman was, why she was here, or how she remained so composed in front of a creature everyone in the mansion regarded as a monster. Brutus still did not move, but his eyes had changed. They no longer held the hard edge of a territorial guardian. Instead, there was a searching look, shaded with wariness, almost curiosity. Emma continued, her voice a whisper, light as a breeze. "I used to be lost too. Strange place, strange people not knowing who to trust. And there was a dog who sat beside me. He didn't do anything, just sat. And that was enough to make me feel less alone. Silence stretched again. Then Brutus lifted his head slightly, shifting his weight as if adjusting his posture, yet never breaking eye contact with Emma. That fleeting moment was enough for Dominic to sense something shifting beneath the surface. Brutus was listening. Perhaps not with his ears, but with something deeper, a part of him Dominic had believed buried forever beneath scars and darkness. Somehow this woman had found the first crack in the wall the animal had built over the years. And Dominic, a man who always believed control was everything, felt his certainty tremble before something he could not define, the unnatural stillness of Brutus, and the soft breath, like voice of a woman who seemed to come from another world. When Emma stepped out of the eastern courtyard, the heavy door slammed shut behind her, like a final period on something unnamed. Security staff lined the hallway on both sides, their faces stunned, still carrying the tremor of fear not yet fully faded. They did not know how to process what had just happened, how this woman had made Brutus, the creature that haunted the entire estate, lie down without a growl, without resistance, without lunging. On the second floor, Dominic had left the balcony. He descended to the main hall, his steps quick and heavy, like thunder pressed inside stone. His face was carved in cold steel, his eyes darkened, as though forced to witness something that defied every rule he had lived by. When Emma turned toward the hall, Dominic was already there, arms crossed, gaze fixed on her like twin blades waiting for judgment. She stopped before him, offering no greeting, no smile, no excuse. She simply looked at him, her eyes strangely serene, as though no power stood between them, no line of fear or submission drawn. Dominic did not need to raise his voice. It naturally carried the weight of someone accustomed to command. He asked directly, without ornament, "Who are you? And who allowed you into that area?" Emma gently set her file bag on the side table, her voice no louder than a casual conversation. Yet it filled the hall with a tone completely at odds with the stone walls accustomed to silence. "My name is Emma Carter. I'm here under assignment from Hope Canine Therapy. They said you required assistance for an animal showing dangerous behavior after trauma." Dominic's jaw tightened. He remembered the name, one among dozens of organizations he had ignored or declined. Clearly, someone in the system had approved the wrong schedule. But what unsettled him was not the mistake. It was what he had just witnessed. He lowered his voice, though every word carried sharp warning. "Do you have any idea how close you came to dying? You were not permitted in that area. That dog could kill a person in seconds." Emma held his gaze. She did not step back. She did not show remorse. Only her eyes deepened, as though searching past his anger into something he refused to name. And then she spoke softly, almost as though asking herself a question. "He isn't violent. He's hurting." For a moment Dominic froze. He did not respond right away. He simply stared at her, his expression rigid, as if dissecting her words, trying to determine what part was delusion and what part was truth. But nothing in her tone rang false. Emma tilted her head slightly and continued. "I've seen that look before. In abandoned animals, in veterans who've lost too much to trust the world again, and in the mirror when I was 17. Dominic felt something inside his chest tighten, sharp and fleeting, like a thin beam of light slipping through a crack he had worked hard to seal. He had long believed Brutus felt nothing, that the dog was merely a living weapon, a piece of the battlefield he had dragged home as a reminder never to allow himself weakness. But this woman who had sat with the creature for only minutes had seen what he refused to see: pain. Dominic said nothing else. He turned away and climbed the stairs, each step taken slowly, as if he needed time to think between every movement. Emma remained where she was for a while, her gaze drifting toward the eastern courtyard door, now closed, as though nothing had happened. But she knew something had begun to change, and not only within the animal. At dawn the next morning, just as the sun lifted over the eastern tree line, Emma stood in the Blackridge sitting room where early light streamed through ceiling-high glass windows and spilled across the polished stone floor like liquid gold. She had been summoned to meet Dominic. The butler led her down the long hallway in complete silence, as though escorting a key witness into a courtroom. Dominic stood beside the fireplace, holding a cup of dense black coffee, his gaze fixed on the faint low flame still struggling to rise. He didn't turn when he heard footsteps, merely set the cup down on the stone table and spoke in a low voice. "You made a mess of everything." Emma did not argue. Dominic turned toward her, his eyes no longer burning with the anger of yesterday, but sharp and steadier like those of a man accustomed to weighing danger against advantage. He stepped closer, stopping just far enough to maintain a boundary. "How long did you sit with Brutus yesterday?" 11 minutes, Emma replied. "I counted by my breaths." Dominic nodded slowly as though cross-checking her answer with the security footage. Then he gestured for the butler to leave. The door closed behind him, and the space between them grew heavier for the unexpected privacy. "Brutus trusts no one. Not even me. That dog is different. It's beyond instinct now. It reacts like a soldier abandoned on a battlefield." "What did you see in him that made you think you could touch him?" Emma did not answer immediately. She met his gaze, her voice gentle but not fragile. "I don't think I can touch him. But I think given time he might allow me near." Dominic said nothing. His mind offered him 100 reasons to send her away, to shut this risk down before it spiraled into something uncontrollable. But another part of him spoke louder, the memory of Brutus lowering his body, not growling, not striking. The look in the dog's eyes when it faced her. That had not been instinct. It had been choice. Dominic turned away, stepping toward the fireplace, his fingers brushing the small sculpture on the mantel, as if speaking to himself. "I don't believe in therapy. I believe in training in control, in boundaries. But there is one thing I cannot deny. Yesterday you crossed a boundary no one has ever crossed." He turned back to her, his eyes locking onto hers. "I'll give you 1 week. 7 days. No more than 2 hours each day. You may approach Brutus, but only in the eastern courtyard, not one step out of place. If I see even the smallest sign that Brutus is agitated or that you cannot control the situation, it ends immediately. And when the week is over, if nothing changes, you leave. Forever." Emma nodded without hesitation. "I agree." Dominic lifted his hand not to shake hers, but as a final binding gesture. "You will not speak to the staff. You will not share any footage, any images, or any information about Brutus. You are not here for science or reputation. You are here because I allow it. Nothing more." Emma looked at his hand for a moment before placing hers against it just barely. It was a contract with no paper, no signatures, no lawyers. Yet it felt as heavy as a sentence handed down in court. When she left the room, Dominic returned to the fireplace and sank into his old leather chair, the one where he had once drunk coffee in silence, with Brutus lying close enough to feel the warmth. He knew this agreement might be the worst mistake of his life, but he also knew some wounds needed only one thing: a person willing to sit beside them. No words, no touch, just presence. And in that fragile moment, Dominic found himself unsure who truly needed the therapy, Brutus or him. Emma returned to the eastern courtyard the next morning at the exact time and in the exact spot, with a small wooden chair the butler had arranged beforehand. She brought no companions, no leash, no treats. Just herself, the chair, and roughly 10 meters of space between her and Brutus, the creature lying motionless beneath an old maple tree, whose red leaves were scattered around his paws. Brutus did not lift his head when she entered. He only opened one eye, letting a somber, almost hollow glance slide over her, as though acknowledging that this figure was familiar but not important. Emma did not come to do anything. She simply sat. Her hands rested on her knees, her breathing steady, her spine straight, her gaze turned not at Brutus, but toward the rustling leaves above. No one told her what to do. She did not ask. She understood that presence itself was sometimes the first form of trust. 40 minutes passed in silence. Brutus did not move. Only his ribcage rose and fell with slow breaths, and his eyes that watched every small shift, as though tracking an unseen tide. At the 41st minute, Emma began to speak. Her voice was low and warm, like telling a story to herself, more than to anyone else. I once had a dog. His name was Toby. A chubby golden Labrador who made as much noise as a wind chime in a storm. I found him in a trash heap after a heavy rain when I was 11 years old. Someone had left him in a cardboard box, soaked freezing and not making a sound. Brutus did not react. His gaze remained fixed on her like a stone watching the tide. Emma expected nothing more. She continued letting the memory flow without needing an audience. For 3 days, Toby didn't eat, didn't drink, didn't move. I thought he would die. But on the 4th night, when I pretended to sleep, he touched my hand. Just a tiny tap, like he wanted to check if I was really there. She paused, lips tightening as though reliving the moment, then whispered on. I didn't move. I stayed still for half an hour, until he curled against me and slept. It was the first night he didn't tremble. A soft breeze brushed through the courtyard, sending a few red leaves gliding across the ground. Brutus had lifted his head now, not quite in response to her, but as though watching the movement of the leaves. Emma noticed, but she showed no reaction. She simply continued sitting. In the silence. In the presence. In the space kept sacred by distance. When the session ended, Emma stood, bowed her head slightly toward Brutus in farewell, and quietly left the courtyard. Brutus did not move, but his eyes followed her until the door closed. On the 2nd floor, behind a heavy curtain, Dominic had watched the entire 2 hours. He did not know what she was doing. She was not teaching, not commanding, not restraining. She was merely telling stories to a dog that seemed not to care. But Dominic had learned to read the subtle reactions of living beings. And he knew those eyes, that gaze, that stillness, no longer belonged entirely to a beast. Something was cracking open, very slowly. But unmistakably, the shifting had begun. On the 2nd morning, Emma returned to the eastern courtyard, carrying the same wooden chair as the day before and a small object wrapped carefully in an old cotton handkerchief. The sky was clearer that day, sunlight slipping through the leaves in long, pale streaks across the cold stone where Brutus already lay, his heavy body, curled eyes half closed, but far from asleep. When Emma opened the door and stepped inside, he opened his eyes. There was no growl, no defensive shift of weight, only a gaze that cut through the space between them, quiet, unfriendly, but no longer as hard as on the first day. Emma sat down, drew a slow breath. She did not speak immediately, nor look directly at him. She observed instead, letting the practiced eye of someone who had worked with hundreds of abandoned animals drift over every slight movement of Brutus, until she stopped at a detail that made her pause. Over his left eye ran a long scar angled from the center of his brow to the outer corner, a patch where the fur never grew back, revealing darkened, raised skin like a chiseled mark on stone. That scar was not from self-defense. It was straight, deep, and toughened, the kind left by something sharp, cutting deliberately through skin. A metal ring or a taut chain ripping repeatedly against flesh. Emma inhaled, her chest tightening. She had seen this before in dogs tethered too long, too tightly, until blood no longer flowed and the skin tore open with each frantic jerk. She said nothing about it. Instead, she bent down and unwrapped the cloth, revealing a small, dark red rubber ball worn with a few faded bite marks. She placed it on the ground about a meter from her, not too close to Brutus, not between them, but off to the side as an invitation without pressure. Then she straightened, hands resting lightly on her thighs, eyes never losing track of the slightest movement from the animal before her. Brutus looked at the ball, not with the curiosity dogs often show, but with a wary, almost haunted attention, as though the small object carried something that had once hurt him. He did not move from his spot, but his gaze did not leave it. Emma began to speak, her voice as steady as the day before, though slower now, deeper. When I was little, my mother bought me a white stuffed bear. It wasn't pretty or expensive, but I took it everywhere. When I was scared, I held it. When I was happy, I told it stories. And then one day, our house was robbed. She paused, her eyes drifting to the space behind Brutus, as if seeing another time altogether. I hid under the bed, holding the bear, not breathing, not crying. When the police found me, I was still there. The bear was still in my hands. After that, they took it away because it was stained with blood. I never saw it again. She looked at the ball. This used to be Toby's toy. I kept it not to play with, but to remember what it felt like to be safe. Sometimes something small can hold a very big memory. Brutus did not move, but his ear twitched slightly. Then a long, slow breath escaped him, longer than usual, as though a tightly pulled thread had loosened. Watching through the monitor, Dominic kept his eyes fixed on Emma, and the red ball, realizing that something was shifting not in the dog, but in the space between them. A subtle change, yet so clear that he could not look away. When the session ended, Emma stood, bowed her head as always, and left without picking up the ball. It remained there waiting. And Brutus, as the door closed behind her, still stared toward the spot where it lay, his expression no longer completely empty, as though a memory had brushed past and touched a place long buried. The third day began under a pale gray sky, thin clouds stretched like mist, faint light filtering through the leaves and tinting the eastern courtyard with a quiet, cool shade of blue. Emma arrived on time as always, her steps unchanged, calm and unhurried. She carried the familiar wooden chair and noticed the small, dark red ball still lying in the same place, now dusted slightly by the night's moisture. Brutus was already there, as though he had never left, resting beneath the old maple tree, his head on his front paws, eyes closed but never truly sleeping. When the door shut behind Emma, one of his ears flicked and one eye opened, fixing on her without surprise, as if her presence had become a familiar part of the day. Emma did not walk toward him. She placed her chair down and sat slowly, exactly as before. But today she did not start with a story. She simply watched him, not directly, not intrusively, but with a quiet, patient, gentle attention. A breeze swept through, carrying the scent of dry grass and maple sap, lifting a few brittle leaves and letting them drift between them. Brutus shifted. Not dramatically, not suddenly, just a subtle forward press of his weight, his massive body easing a little closer. She noticed. Her heart thudded once hard, but her face remained calm. She did not praise him, did not speak, did not gesture. She simply accepted it as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Minutes passed. Brutus inched forward again, this time visibly. One front paw stretched farther ahead, his lower body sliding forward by half a step. The wind stilled. The world seemed to hold its breath. Emma stayed motionless, though she unconsciously clasped her hands a little tighter in her lap. Then Brutus surged forward once more, lifting his upper body, his weight shifting too fast, making that immense form tip forward for an instant. It was merely a balance adjustment, but to an untrained eye it looked like a sudden pounce. Emma startled. She could not stop the reflex, her shoulders tightened, her breath caught. But she did not stand. She did not retreat. Just one slow exhale and she regained control. Her eyes met his. He had stopped still, low to the ground, eyes wide now, neck stiff, waiting for her next reaction. Emma took a deep breath, then released it gently. "I'm sorry, you just surprised me a little," she said softly, voice low but steady enough to reach him. "It wasn't you. It was me. I'm still learning how not to be afraid." She remained exactly where she was. Brutus watched her for a moment longer, then huffed out a breath as though expelling the last tension left in his frame. His head lowered again, But he did not return to his original place. He settled in the new spot closer to the red ball, closer to Emma. She stayed another 30 minutes in that fragile silence, speaking no more, understanding that today words would have only gotten in the way. When she rose and bowed her head, Brutus watched her but did not move. In the surveillance room, Dominic stood before the screen, arms folded, his gaze dark. He had seen that forward lunge, and Emma's reflex. Anyone else would have bolted. But she hadn't. She had stayed, a small anchor in a rising storm. He exhaled very softly. Part of him did not want to believe it. But another part knew the truth. The beast had begun to change. And the force moving him was not chains, nor commands, nor punishment. It was patience and eyes unafraid of what they saw. The fourth day began with the sound of soft rain tapping against the villa's tiled roof, each drop falling onto the gray stone courtyard in small, shimmering circles. Emma stepped into the eastern yard wearing a long coat and holding a clear umbrella. But when she saw Brutus already sitting beneath the maple tree as always, his head raised to watch her from afar, she quietly folded the umbrella, letting the rain soak her shoulders and hair as she walked to place her chair in its usual spot. The distance between them was still more than 6 paces, yet it no longer felt like an invisible wall. She could sense it. Brutus was not lying down today. He sat as if waiting, not in vigilance or in ambush, but with a kind of deliberate presence. Emma did not speak immediately. She looked at the rain, then at Brutus. The dog stayed silent, only his eyes following every small movement she made, as though each gesture carried a message. After a few minutes, Emma began to speak. Her story today was not about her past, but a childhood tale about a dragon chained in darkness, feared and driven away by everyone, until someone found it and sat beside it, not to conquer but simply to listen. The dragon had meant to devour that person, yet for reasons it could not name. It did not, because for the first time someone looked at it without trembling. Emma's voice was warm and low, rain drumming steadily on the eaves water, whispering along the stone channels around the courtyard. Brutus did not move, but his eyes never left her face. When Emma neared the story's end, when the dragon finally lifted its head, looked at the person, and dipped it gently, as if to say, "I hear you, I understand," she fell silent. A breeze drifted through, carrying the scent of wet earth and the faint warmth of damp fur. She did not expect anything. But then Brutus, the creature so many had called emotionless, tilted his head slightly toward her. It was not much, only a small nod, but to Emma it was the first fragile sign of empathy. She remained still, though her breath gathered tight in her chest. A small motion, but to her it was the first note in a long, silent song. In the surveillance room, Dominic froze. The screen before him had no sound, only a monochrome image from the courtyard camera. He saw her telling the story, saw Brutus unblinking, and saw with absolute clarity that subtle, almost invisible nod. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, as though afraid to trust what he had just witnessed. He had lived through life or death negotiations, knew every sign of agreement, and he understood that for a creature wounded as deeply as Brutus, a nod was not instinct. It was acknowledgement, the first whispered answer after years of silence. Below in the rain, Emma let a faint smile appear, not for victory, but because she had just heard the first sound of a stone wall beginning to crack. Brutus did not turn away. He watched her, his gaze no longer weighted with the deep sorrow of the first day. When she rose, as always, she took nothing with her, but this time she left a soft phrase, unsure if he even heard. "Thank you for listening." She walked away into the rain. And Brutus, for the first time since entering this territory 3 years ago, did not watch her with the eyes of a sentinel, but with something that felt almost like waiting. Dominic Rourke stood motionless in the surveillance room, his eyes fixed on the black and white frame where the dog who had once terrified the entire estate had just tilted his head at a fairy tale. Brutus's slight nod did more than shake the household's perceptions. It reached down into a buried memory in Dominic's mind, a memory hidden beneath layers of classified files and blood-soaked nightmares. Years ago, long before he became the master of Blackridge and the silent force behind dealings no one dared to name, Dominic had been an undercover operative for the Central Intelligence Agency, assigned to intercontinental missions entangled with arms trafficking, narcotics, and even living creatures. One of the darkest assignments took him to Syria, where reports spoke of a training camp run by a covert network linked to extremist groups. The dogs there were not trained to protect. They were turned into living weapons attack, on command kill on reflex, no distinction in targets. During the night raid, Dominic led a three-man team into the compound, buried deep in a bomb-scarred zone where even light seemed like a luxury. They expected to gather evidence, destroy the facility, and retreat. But then Dominic heard a strangled growl, not the sound of a wild animal, but of pain crushed beneath blades and chains. He broke from the safe route and moved down a row of iron kennels. At the end, among rusted mesh and concrete reeking of filth, stood a dog unlike any he had seen. Massive frame, gray fur matted with blood, and mud eyes blazing with a fury that looked ready to boil over. It stood in the center of the cage, not retreating, not barking, only staring at him, as though defying the world itself. But Dominic did not see a threat. He saw despair. The patchwork scars across its body told a story more horrific than any report. The creature had been turned into a tool pushed to the limits of suffering, yet still alive. When the team retreated, Dominic did what every teammate argued against. He unchained the dog and carried it out, despite its reflexive bite sinking deep into his shoulder. He did not retaliate, did not shoot. He only whispered, "It's over. I'm getting you out of here." They named him Brutus after a soldier joked about the bite mark on Dominic's arm cutting nearly to the bone. The dog was brought to the United States through an unofficial logistics channel, and Dominic personally paid for veterinarians to save him until he could stand again. But Brutus did not recover. He stopped biting, but he never trusted. He thrashed in nightmares, howled at sudden noises, recoiled in terror if anyone moved too fast. After leaving the CIA, Dominic brought him along not out of pity but out of debt. In Dominic's eyes, Brutus was not a monster. He was living proof of what the underground world could do to a pure soul if given enough time and violence. Dominic built Blackridge, not to hide, but to isolate Brutus, to protect him from the world, and protect the world from him. He tried everything: training therapy, behavioral medicine, even neural signal protocols. Nothing could make Brutus trust humans again. Until this week, when a woman named Emma Carter walked into his life with eyes that held no command, no fear. Dominic watched the screen, now seeing the dog he once carried from hell tilt his head to a fairy tale. He felt himself again as the soldier standing before that blood-stained cage years ago. But this time he was not the one opening the door, and the one lifting the creature's head was not a command. It was a story, light as wind repeating itself beneath the drumming rain, quietly breaking the chains that had bound its heart for all those years. Emma sat in the small sitting room behind the kitchen, where the warm amber glow of the overhead lamp fell across her hands, wrapped around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. Outside, the drizzle tapped softly against the window pane, each drop an uneven heartbeat, calling back pieces of a past she rarely allowed herself to touch. She didn't understand why today, after 4 days face-to-face with Brutus, her mind had carried her back there to the place where everything in her life had broken open. At 14, Emma watched her parents die in front of her during an armed robbery at a convenience store on the outskirts of Chicago. She never forgot the icy shock when her father's hand slipped out of hers, or the way her mother's scream vanished beneath the thunder of gunfire and the flashing lights of the patrol cars that arrived too late. Emma survived, but only her body. The rest of her drifted into a silent void for months. Doctors called it post-traumatic depression paired with severe anxiety. She didn't speak, didn't eat, didn't engage. She sat in her room, staring at blank walls with empty eyes that looked through everything and everyone. Therapy did nothing. Medication carved her even further away from reality, until the day they brought in a dog. A golden retriever named Max, bigger than she was then, with warm breath and honey-brown eyes that settled beside her like a living anchor. Max had been trained as a therapy dog for traumatized children, yet no one expected much. Emma had sealed every window and door inside herself. Her first reaction came when Max pulled down the corner of her blanket, tugging just enough to make her lift her head. The second came when he rested his head on her lap and fell asleep there, his steady breathing reminding her that another heartbeat existed beside her own. One night, Emma finally spoke, her first words in 6 months. "Can you hear me?" Max didn't answer. He simply placed a paw on her hand and nudged his nose into her cold palm. And for the first time in half a year, Emma cried. Healing didn't come in miracles. It arrived slowly, day by day, breath by breath, with Max lying beside her patient and silent, reminding her that even in a brutal world, patches of gentleness still lived. When she recovered, she devoted herself to the study of animal psychology, hoping one day she might give someone what Max had given her. She never forgot the dog who pulled her back from the edge. Max died when she was 21, peaceful, old, and still resting his head on her lap, just as he had the first night he saved her. She kept his collar, a sacred thing, and she carried it silently with her into Blackridge. When Emma spoke to Brutus when she sat beside that shadow of rage and sorrow, she carried Max in her heart, not to compare, but to remind herself that no creature is born a monster. Something makes them that way. The hands that hurt instead of hold, just like people. And when Emma looked into Brutus's eyes, she didn't see teeth or threat. She saw her 14-year-old self, lost, betrayed by the world, longing for someone, anyone, to sit beside her and not walk away. Dominic didn't know any of this. No one at Blackridge did. But on the fourth night, when he watched Brutus nod at the end of Emma's story, something in her eyes told him she wasn't telling tales to save the dog. She was telling them to speak aloud a truth she had never been able to voice. And Brutus was the first to hear it, without judgment, without leaving, only listening, just as Max once had. And sometimes that alone is enough to save a life. By late afternoon, the wind began to rise, dragging thick black clouds across the valley like some ancient fury waking from sleep. Emma stood at her window, fingers tightening around Toby's worn collar in her coat pocket, eyes drifting toward Brutus's enclosure. Storms always stirred something in her, a strange intuition, as though bad weather awakened the buried terror inside creatures who had lived through hell. And tonight, that feeling clung to her like a shadow. The first crack of thunder split the sky just as Dominic sat in his office staring at financial charts he couldn't focus on. Lightning tore through the clouds, lighting the forest for one stark second. Then the howl came. A long, fractured cry from the eastern wing. Dominic froze. He had never heard Brutus make that sound. Not a warning growl, not the beginning of an attack. It was terror. Pure primal terror. Emma heard it too. She ran from her room like a streak of wind, ignoring the rain lashing down, ignoring the rule that no one was allowed near Brutus after 9 at night. The storm ripped at the awnings, rain stung her face, but she didn't slow. At the enclosure door, she found Brutus in a frenzy, not attacking, not breaking out, but spinning in circles, slamming his head into the wall, claws scraping concrete as though fighting memories only he could see. His eyes were not fierce. They were clouded with panic. Emma opened the door without hesitation. Thunder cracked overhead. Brutus jerked toward her, teeth, bared eyes blood red in the flash of lightning. But then another bolt lit the room, and instead of lunging, he crumpled inward, whimpering like a frightened pup. Emma dropped to her knees, arms open, voice trembling but steady. "It's okay, Brutus. It's okay. I'm here." His breathing was frantic, dragging from the depths of panic. He hesitated 1 second too, then stumbled toward her. His paws skidded on the wet floor, but still he moved closer. She didn't flinch. She let his massive head press into her shoulder before she gently placed her hand on his neck, feeling every tremor ripple through him. Then she wrapped her arms around him, not the way a person hugs their pet, but the way two survivors meet in the ruins of shared memory, the way one soul saves another because someone once saved them. Outside the wind screamed, and lightning shook the earth, but inside the enclosure a fragile peace settled, one that only the broken truly recognize. Dominic arrived moments later when the security system detected the open door. He nearly slipped on the rain-slicked tiles, his heart slamming into his ribs as he peered inside. And there, through the storm, he saw Emma kneeling on the floor, Brutus's head pressed into her lap, like a child seeking safety. He didn't dare take another step. He simply stood there in the rain, watching the moment unfold, knowing with absolute certainty that the storm outside had nothing on the storm being quieted inside that room. Emma whispered into Brutus's ear, her voice thick with emotion. "I know that feeling, the one where every sound becomes a threat, where the darkness takes your breath. I know it. I've lived it." Brutus whimpered softly, no trace of violence left in him. He lowered himself completely, laying his head on her legs, his breathing gradually settling. The rain kept pouring, thunder kept roaring, but inside that small enclosure lived a different kind of stillness, one that only those who have been shattered can truly understand. Dominic backed away slowly, silently, letting the moment stay whole. And in the frozen chambers of his own heart, something began to thaw. Emma didn't know he was there. She didn't care. Right now, there was only her and Brutus. And Max's old collar lying on the floor beneath Brutus's head, like a small quiet reminder that some souls never really leave. They simply pass the torch from one gaze to the next, from one heartbeat to another, keeping the last survivor alive. The rain had not yet stopped when Emma stepped out of Brutus's enclosure, her clothes clinging to her skin, soaked through her hair, plastered to her forehead, yet her eyes shone brighter than they ever had. Brutus no longer growled or whimpered. He simply lay inside his head, resting on the old collar, as if he understood that tonight what he needed was not shelter, but a heart gentle enough to stand with him through the storm of memory. Dominic waited for her beneath the shed's overhang, his leather jacket, drenched hands buried in his pockets, as though to hide the slight tremor in his fingers. When she reached him, he said nothing, only motioned for her to follow. They walked into a small room behind the main house where a fire had been lit against the cold. Dominic poured her a small glass of brandy and slid it toward her without meeting her eyes. Emma sat across from him in silence. Only the sound of crackling wood and raindrops tapping against the metal roof filled the space. A long time passed before Dominic spoke, his voice rough and low, as if each word had been pulled from a wound that had stayed closed far too long. "You know, he used to be gentle like that with someone." Emma looked up, her eyes meeting his deep, cavernous gaze. "A little girl," he said. "I adopted her when she was 9. She'd been abandoned during a drug raid on the Colombian border. No one wanted her, and I'd just come off a mission. I suppose I brought her home as an excuse to hold on to something that wasn't stained with blood. Her name was Lily. Brown eyes, wild hair, always asking questions that stopped me cold. And strangely enough, despite everything she'd seen, she was never afraid of Brutus, even when he was a nightmare, the real kind." He paused for breath. "Brutus once tore through a guard's arm at that training camp just because the man shouted too loudly. But when Lily walked in, he went still. He let her touch his ears, his neck, even the places covered in scars. No one could understand why. And now, I don't understand why he let you hold him in that panic the way he did." Dominic reached into his wallet and slid an old photograph toward her. Emma lifted it with trembling fingers. The picture showed a small girl laughing, her arms wrapped around a younger Brutus. The girl's eyes looked eerily like Emma's. Not the shape, but something deeper. Something only those who had once been lost could recognize in each other. "She's gone," Dominic said, the words fracturing in the quiet room. "3 years ago, A car accident in the rain. Brutus was in the back seat with her. He always was. When the car flipped, I was thrown clear, but Lily, she was trapped. Dominic looked away, his jaw tightening. Brutus didn't have a scratch on him because he had wrapped his body around her. He shielded her from the impact, but he couldn't save her life. When the paramedics tried to take her body away, it took 4 men to pull him off her. That was the moment he broke. He didn't just go mad, Emma. He decided that if he couldn't protect the only thing he loved, then the whole world was an enemy. He hasn't let anyone touch him since the moment they took her away. Until you. I didn't abandon him, but I couldn't get close either. Looking at him was like looking at her. At my failure. Every time he howled at night, I kept thinking, it should have been me. Emma held the photograph, her hand shaking slightly. She said nothing, but something rose quietly inside her, an inexplicable feeling, as if fate had drawn a strange circle around her life and placed her here in this house, at this precise moment. Dominic studied her for a long time, then exhaled. For the first time since she had arrived, his gaze softened, shedding its armor of command and suspicion. You remind me of her. Not just in how you look, in how you talk. The way you look at Brutus. The way you sit quietly beside him, as if you know exactly what he's fighting. I don't know what to call it. Coincidence. Fate. But I see it. And so does he. Emma set the photograph down and looked up, her voice soft as wind slipping through a cracked door. There are connections we don't need to explain. They just happen. And when they do, they heal more than words ever could. Dominic held her gaze for a long-waited moment. Then he nodded, slowly, gently, like a confession finally granted forgiveness. Outside the rain still fell, but in the small room where 2 people carried hearts full of fractures, the air no longer felt heavy. And somewhere near the wooden enclosure in the east wing, Brutus lay quietly with his eyes closed, no longer crying out into the storm, as if he finally understood that his pain had never been a sin, only a wound no one had touched the right way. Until tonight. After that storm-laden night, the Rourke estate seemed to slip into a different orbit, quietly, but unmistakably. The next morning, before sunlight reached the treetops in the eastern garden, one of the house staff gasped when she saw Emma descending from the 3rd-floor staircase with a cup of tea in hand. And following her step by heavy step was Brutus. No leash. No muzzle, no guard hovering nearby. The same dog who once nearly tore off the arm of the estate's strongest security officer now walked beside a slender woman, as though he were her shadow. And Emma showed no fear. She didn't look back, didn't give orders. She simply walked steady, unhurried, and Brutus followed, calm, silent, loyal. In the dining room, when she sat down at the guest table, Brutus settled beneath her chair, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed as if guarding a dream. Maria, the longtime cook, nearly dropped a plate of eggs. A young guard reached for his gun out of reflex, but Dominic raised a hand from across the room, his expression so composed it struck fear in those watching. Brutus behaved. He didn't bark, didn't growl. When Emma reached down and scratched behind his left ear, he even let out a soft huff and curled his leg like a spoiled house pet. Every gaze in the room fixed on them as though witnessing something that defied the laws of the world they knew. Rumors spread quickly. Some whispered that Emma was a beast whisperer. Others insisted she must have sedated him, but the only person who understood what was truly happening stood on the upstairs balcony, arms crossed, watching with eyes that no longer looked cold, but heavy with something beginning to grow. For years, Brutus had allowed no one near him, not even when injured, not even when Dominic himself delivered food. The dog had been broken, reshaped into a living weapon built to protect, to attack, and capable of trust. But now, whenever Emma left a room, Brutus followed. When she read outside, he lay beneath the tree beside her. When she placed her hand on one of the scars on his neck, he tilted his head not to retreat, but to allow it. One early morning, Dominic decided to test the boundary. He approached as Emma and Brutus sat together on the western porch. Emma lifted her gaze calm as ever. Brutus saw him but did not rise or snarl. He simply watched, assessing him, then lowered his head again at Emma's side. Dominic stood still a while before taking a slow seat in a chair a few steps away. No one spoke. The wind moved across the estate's roofline, carrying the scent of pine sap and the last traces of night's chill. For the first time in years, Dominic felt no fear standing near Brutus, no helplessness. Instead, he felt something else, something tender and aching, like the feeling he got when he lingered too long on Lily's photograph. There was nothing left to control, only something left to protect. Emma turned to him and asked softly, "Would you like to touch him?" Dominic didn't answer immediately. He lowered his gaze to the creature lying at her feet, then extended his hand inch by inch. Brutus lifted his head. His nose twitched. No warning, no threat, only a quiet, gentle nudge like a breeze at the start of a new season. Dominic placed his hand on the dog's thick fur, feeling the warmth and the steady heartbeat beneath. It felt like a second chance, one he had never imagined possible, and Emma, with a voice soft as that stormy night, whispered, "Sometimes the things we cannot explain are the only ones worth believing." Brutus was no longer the nightmare of Blackridge. From that night onward, he became proof of a quiet miracle no one dared to name, but everyone felt forgiveness. Not spoken aloud, but given in the slight nod of a creature once betrayed by humans. And in the slow, steady footsteps of a woman who had once been swallowed by darkness, now leading another wounded soul back toward the light. One late afternoon, the house was unusually quiet. Dominic had gone into the city for a rare meeting. Emma was walking down the West Wing hallway when she noticed Brutus stop in front of a heavy mahogany door that was always kept locked, Dominic's private study. Today, however, the door was slightly ajar. A draft must have pushed it open. Before Emma could call him back, Brutus pushed the door with his nose and walked inside, his tail wagging slowly. Emma hesitated. She knew this room was strictly off-limits, but she couldn't leave Brutus in there alone. She stepped inside, intending to grab his collar and leave immediately. The room smelled of old leather, cigar smoke, and memories. Brutus sat down next to the massive oak desk, resting his chin on the chair Dominic usually occupied. Emma walked over to the desk to guide the dog away, but her eyes were drawn to a solitary open folder lying in the center of the dark wood, illuminated by the dying light of the sunset. It wasn't dusty or forgotten. It looked recently handled. Next to it was a half-empty glass of scotch. Curiosity warred with respect, but the photograph clipped to the top page stopped her breath. It wasn't a tactical map or a weapon schematic. It was a grainy black-and-white picture of a child. The first page bore a title, "Classified Data Refugee Children from the Syria Withdrawal Operation of the year 2002. Beneath it was a long list of names without surnames, only birth years and locations where they had been found. Emma's eyes stopped at the 13th line. Name, Emma Carter. Age 5. Mother, Sarah Carter. U.S. medical volunteer confirmed deceased in action. Location found. Sector 4 ruins, outskirts of Aleppo. Personal effects. One small silver bracelet engraved with the inscription, "My Hope," found on the mother and secured onto the child's wrist by the extraction team leader prior to evacuation. Status transferred to next of kin. Grandparents in Chicago under witness protection protocols. Emma froze. She remembered that bracelet. It had been found with her after the robbery. She had been told she was born and raised in Chicago. But this file, that bracelet, and the faint scar at the back of her neck, one she had never known the origin of, began to align into a terrifying portrait of a past that had never been spoken aloud. She flipped to the next pages. They contained first aid reports describing a child rescued at the same time as a group of wounded women, several of whom did not survive. There were black and white images taken from military cameras, blurry and grainy. Yet in one of them she recognized her own eyes staring into the lens, her face streaked with dust and blood, clutching a small, injured dog. No one had ever mentioned that dog. No one had ever recorded its name. But Emma remembered. Even though she had been so young, she remembered not crying, only holding tightly to the one living creature beside her. In another corner of the file, a page noted, Agent Rourke directed emergency evacuation, prioritizing the rescue of women and children in the conflict zone. Rourke. Dominic. Her fingers gripped the metal edge of the table as her heartbeat tumbled wildly. He had been there. He had not only rescued Brutus, he might have been the man who carried her out of the rubble of a town swallowed by war. Her entire life she had believed she was an American child, the victim of a robbery. Yet her true past had been buried beneath paperwork and memories someone had chosen to conceal. Now, as the truth flickered into view, she did not know what she was supposed to feel. Trembling anger or gratitude for the simple fact that someone on that night of darkness had chosen not to turn away. She closed the file, her pulse still racing, like the faint tapping of a memory that had never fully returned. Something was becoming clearer than ever. A fragile, yet undeniable thread linked her to Brutus, to Dominic, and to that distant land where she had lost everything except her life. And that life was now pulling her backward, urging her to seek the answers to who she truly was. Under the soft golden light of Dominic's study, Emma stood in silence before his large wooden desk, her hands trembling around the old file, while Dominic Rourke sat motionless behind it, his eyes fixed on the one page she had set in front of him. The blurred black and white photograph captured by a tactical camera showed a little girl covered in soot and fear clutching a small skinny dog in the ruins. Her gaze, though shadowed by terror, held something indescribable. It was not fear, it was a hollow emptiness. Dominic tightened his hold on the picture, his eyes flickering with memories breaking loose like shards of long buried glass. He rose abruptly, walked to the shelf behind him, and pulled down a wooden box secured with a brass latch. He said nothing as he unlocked it and removed a thin stack of documents so old that the edges had worn away. He flipped through them quickly as if searching for a breath he had lost years ago. Then he stopped at one photograph. A child wrapped in a military blanket, her hands smeared with blood held in the arms of a man in uniform, the other arm supporting a small unconscious dog. The man's face was only partially visible, but it was unmistakably Dominic. He froze, eyes wide, the entire room sinking into a strange stillness. He lifted his gaze to Emma, and this time his look was not that of the master of Blackridge Estate, but of a man who had just collided with a past he thought had been erased. My God! Dominic stepped back, as if struck in the chest. It was you. It really was you. Emma said nothing, only nodded faintly, her throat tightening. I carried you, he whispered. I remember now. A little girl whose eyes held no expression at all. I thought you wouldn't make it. But you didn't cry. Not once. You just held that dog and stared at me as if asking why everything had vanished. He stepped closer, studying her face, the soft gray eyes that still carried the quiet weight of a life lived in fragments. I remember that bracelet, he whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of a 20-year-old memory. Because I was the one who put it on you. He stepped closer, his eyes dark with pain. Your mother. She tried to shield you until the very end. When I found you in the rubble, she was gone. That bracelet had slipped from her hand. I picked it up, clasped it onto your tiny wrist, and made a promise to her. I told her that even though I couldn't save her, I would get her hope home safely. You didn't cry. You just held onto my tactical vest, and that little dog staring at me as if trusting me was the only choice left. I held you through the entire flight. You refused to let go of that puppy. It was badly hurt just like you. I remember you whispering to it, promising it would be okay. But the poor thing didn't make it. It died in your arms, just as the helicopter touched down. That was the only time I saw you cry. You didn't cry for your mother or for your wounds. You cried because you couldn't save him, and I think that is why you are here now. You have spent your whole life saving every Brutus you could find, trying to make up for that one life you lost in the sky 20 years ago. The room was so still they could hear the ticking of the old wall clock. Emma had no idea what she was supposed to feel. There were no tears, no anger, only the dizzying sense that her life had spun in a full circle and dropped her exactly where she needed to be. "Why did no one ever tell me?" she whispered. Dominic exhaled heavily, his gaze unwavering. "After that operation, we were required to transfer all rescued children to an international humanitarian agency. The files were encrypted for safety. Your name may have been entered wrong or deliberately altered for protection. I I never thought I would see you again. Not until you walked through the gates of Blackridge." He sat heavily, the weight of the past pressing on him again. "I felt something familiar about you. The way you looked at Brutus, the way you told stories, the sound of your voice. But I convinced myself it was just memory playing tricks. I didn't dare believe it." Emma stepped forward and gently placed her hand on the photograph between them. The child in that picture was gone. But the woman standing here, shaped by scattered memories and guided by a dog who had once been her only anchor to life, was undeniably real. "I don't remember clearly," she said softly. "Only fragments. But I remember the feeling of helplessness when that puppy stopped breathing. For years I was empty, until I found Toby in that trash heap. Saving Toby was how I saved myself. And when I saw Brutus, I didn't see a monster, I saw that puppy again. But this time, Dominic, I knew I wouldn't let him die." Dominic closed his eyes, and a single tear slipped down his cheek. "Destiny. God brought you back, not only to heal Brutus, but to heal me." Emma nodded gently. There was nothing more to say. They stood there together, suspended between past and present, two souls who had once been broken, realizing they had never truly been separated. And perhaps everything had begun with an embrace long ago, amid smoke and ruin, between two lives that had unknowingly been meant to find each other again. Under the broad canopy of the old oak in the center courtyard of Blackridge Estate, Dominic Rourke stood silently beside the tall window, looking out toward the open grounds, where Brutus lay beside Emma, his head resting on her lap, as if it had been that way his entire life. The sight, though repeated over the past several days, stirred something in him, every time the same ache, the same quiet pull he had felt the first day he saw it. From the moment he realized Emma was the same little girl he had carried out of a war zone so many years ago, something in Dominic had shifted. Not suddenly, not with any dramatic force, but slowly, quietly, like a morning breeze, sliding through shutters that had been closed far too long. In the days that followed, Dominic hardly left Blackridge. He no longer buried himself in meetings or retreated to the balcony on the second floor with his usual cigar each evening. Instead, he spent hours reading through old files, old reports on Brutus, old images of the tiny Emma wrapped in a military blanket as she was lifted from the rubble. He rewatched the security footage in which she walked across the courtyard, without a trace of fear, where Brutus, the same creature that had once terrified everyone, sat calmly beside her, like a lost child, finally finding someone who understood him. Dominic knew this could not simply be coincidence. That morning, he called Emma to the study. She stepped inside with her usual quiet composure, though her eyes carried a faint expectancy, as if she too sensed that something irreversible was about to unfold. Dominic did not circle around the matter. He placed a folder on the desk, its cover stamped with the emblem of a renowned animal-assisted therapy organization. "You once said Brutus wasn't violent, only hurting." He began, his voice slow and deliberate. "You were right. Not just him, but this place, and the people around you. We have all lived with wounds we chose to cage, labeling them as dangerous, unstable, beyond repair." Emma nodded softly. Dominic continued, his gaze drifting as if looking straight through the years. "Brutus is a reflection of me. We both learned to survive through defense. But you taught him and taught me something no strategy and no weapon ever has: trust." He pushed the folder toward her. "I want to open Blackridge. I want this organization to establish a program here. I want people wounded like Brutus to have a chance to heal, and you will lead this project. Brutus will be the symbol of recovery. Emma looked at him, her eyes brightening with an emotion she struggled to contain. Dominic smiled gently for the first time in many years without the armor he usually wore. Blackridge used to be a fortress. Now, I want it to be a place to begin again. News of his decision spread quickly, leaving the longtime staff stunned. Many whispered, unable to believe the once cold former operative could take such a step. But all doubts dissolved the moment Brutus the dog, once labeled untamable, walked into the courtyard alongside a group of children who had survived trauma and allowed them to touch his ears, stroke his back, and tell him their stories. A little boy abandoned by his father during a winter storm now sat beside Brutus with no fear in his eyes. A young girl who had witnessed her mother's death in an accident laughed as Brutus nudged her hand with his tongue. Each time Brutus lowered his head to listen, each slow wag of his tail stitched back a piece of those children's memories. Journalists, psychologists, and volunteers came to Blackridge. But what they never forgot was the sight of Brutus sitting in the courtyard at sunset, the golden light brushing over fur that had once bristled from fear, now softened beneath Emma's gentle gaze. Dominic stood behind the window watching. He needed no praise, no headlines, no applause. He only needed to know that after so many years of shadows, this place was finally breathing again. And with a quiet nod to himself, he understood he had opened a door he once believed could never be opened. A door leading toward renewal. When dusk settled over Blackridge, the last light of day spilled across the lawn like an amber blanket gently covering every scar of the past. Emma sat beneath the oak, her back resting against the trunk, her soft brown hair stirring in the evening breeze. Beside her, Brutus lay peacefully, his head against her leg, his breathing slow and steady. There was no trace of fury in him now, no red-tinged eyes from the strain of old nightmares, no growl reverberating through the halls of the estate. In its place was a quiet stillness, a kind of peace only those who have known deep pain can ever truly reach. Emma stroked the top of his head, feeling each warm breath drift through the thin fabric of her dress. Brutus did not flinch, did not tense. He merely blinked once and closed his eyes. It was not a gesture of surrender to fear, but an act of absolute trust. A surrender not to danger, but to love. She watched him for a long moment, then began telling him a story, her voice soft as wind weaving through leaves. It was about a dog who lived in a grand castle created not to guard, but to be loved. But the frightened people around him locked him away, gave him the name of a monster, and made the world fear him. The dog forgot he had once known joy, once wagged his tail at the sound of a kind voice, once lifted his head when someone spoke his name with tenderness. Until one day, someone came who did not fear him. She sat down, not to tame him or command him, but simply to be there and listen. And the dog opened his heart, not because he was forced to, but because his heart had finally been touched with love. That little fairy tale had no prince, no princess, only a person and a dog, but it was enough to change an entire small world. When she reached the final lines, Emma glanced at Brutus and saw that he was asleep. Not the restless sleep of someone haunted, but a true sleep, deep and safe. For the first time in years, he slept without fleeing from the memories that once consumed him. On the distant upper balcony, Dominic stepped out, his gaze drawn to them, unable to speak. Brutus, whom he had believed broken beyond saving, now slept like a child in the lap of the woman who had walked into his life like a miracle. Blackridge, once a home of secrets and turmoil, had become a place of healing and hope. This story is not only about a dog or a brave woman, it is a reminder to all of us that some wounds cannot be seen from the outside, that some spirits need time, patience, and compassion to return to themselves, and that in a world where people hurry too quickly to judge, sometimes all it takes is one person who pauses, listens, and refuses to turn away for healing to begin. And you hearing this now, Do you find a piece of yourself in this story? Has someone in your life ever been like Brutus crying out in silence because no one understood? Have you ever been like Emma, courageous enough to love something others warned you to avoid? We would love to hear your feelings in the comments below. Share your story, even a small one, because you never know whose heart it may warm. Do not forget to subscribe to our channel so you will not miss the stories that touch the heart every day. Please like and share this video with someone who may need it. Thank you for walking with us to the end of this journey. We wish you good health and a peaceful, fulfilling life each day. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.